Sup people, Red Vince here, and welcome back to Red Vince Reviews. In 2013, DreamWorks Animation released a film called Turbo.
The film could be summed up in one word.
Meh.
The consensus seemed to be that it wasn't really a terrible movie, but it just wasn't anything that great. It was just your standard kids movie meant to keep the kids occupied, but not offering much for the adults. I bring this up because this year, DreamWorks released what is, at the time of this video, their latest animated film, Home. And the consensus for this movie seems to be that it's the Turbo of 2015.
And in some respects they're right, but in others I'm not so sure. If I had to sum this movie up in one word, it would be, well, likable. This is a very likable movie, but it doesn't really offer anything spectacular in comparison to other animated movies. Or even just other DreamWorks movies. What do I mean by this?
Well, for starters, the story of this movie is pretty basic, but also kind of complicated. It's about an alien named O, who's part of an alien race called the Boov.
Stupidest sounding name for aliens ever, by the way.
Anyway, the Boov come and take over Earth simply because they need a new place to live, because they're on the run from an enemy race of aliens called the Gorg. But O screws up and gives away the new location of the Boov, and thus the entire culture labels O a fugitive. While O is on the run, he comes across a girl named Tip, who got separated from her mother when the Boov took over Earth. So the two team up and set out to find the location of Tip's mother and a place where O can hide.
The elements to the story are pretty cliche and pretty easy to figure how it'll all work out.
You got the screw-up who's the outcast among his people, but eventually they'll warm up to him and consider him a hero. You got the two main leads, who are polar opposites and don't get along, but as time goes on they warm up to each other and become good friends. You got the two main leads suddenly getting in a big fight, and end up going their separate ways, only to be reunited later. Yeah, this is about as predictable as it gets.
But at the same time, the story is also kinda complex, because the focus isn't very consistent.
First, it's about O trying to fix his mistake before the Gorg arrive, while also avoiding getting captured by his people. But then about halfway through the movie, he actually does fix his mistake, and then it becomes about O still trying to hide from his people, who still want to capture him, because he has made plenty of mistakes in the past, and will no doubt make plenty more mistakes in the future.
Isn't that great logic?
But since the Boov are still going to hunt O down even after his mistake is fixed, it makes the mistake pretty pointless. And for that matter, the new plot point really ends up taking a back seat to the one about Tip trying to find her mom. And by the time they finally do find her, the plot point about O just sort of stops when the Gorg manages to find the Boov anyway. Then the Boov realize making mistakes isn't a bad thing and they make O their new leader. And yeah, just having the Gorg find them anyway makes the plot point about O fixing his mistake even more pointless, since the whole point of fixing it was to keep the Gorg from finding them. On top of everything, you also got the surprise reveal as to why the Gorg are after the Boov in the first place, and the scenes where Tip and O start to form a friendship.
You got all that? Despite all this, though, it never gets to the point where you can't follow the plot. The plot points do flow decently enough, and they don't overlap each other a great deal. It's just that there's more of them than needed. How about the characters? Well, surprisingly, there aren't that many of them.
The majority of the movie is just spent with the two leads, while occasionally cutting to the Boov. First, you have O, played by Jim Parsons, or as you may know him, Sheldon Cooper from Big Bang Theory. Like I said before, he's just your typical screw-up, and nothing in particular sets him apart from other screw-up characters. But at the same time, though, he's just very likable. In fact, when I said earlier that this is a very likable film, the majority of it is because of this character. I think this comes from a combination of two things that just blend together perfectly. One is just how naive yet optimistic this guy is. It's clear that he's pretty clueless, but he approaches everything he does with such enthusiasm and happiness, it's kind of hard not to enjoy. Yeah, he's also a coward and pessimistic at times, but I think it's mostly from the philosophy of cowardice his people have brainwashed him to believe. When he actually thinks for himself, he just gets so excited about everything. Like when the Boov moved to Earth. The other thing that makes this character so likable is Jim Parsons' performance. He manages to hit just the right note of optimistic, naive, fear, or whatever the scene calls for, without going too far and being annoying. Tip is played by Rihanna, who, I'll be honest, I'm just not a fan of. I don't think she's that great of an actress, and I don't think her music is that good either.
And by the way, if you don't like her music either, you are screwed, because there are Rihanna songs all over this movie. There's one like every 15 minutes, and on top of that, they all sound the same. It's like they just rehashed the same song over and over.
Well, anyways, her performance in this movie isn't terrible, but not that great either. Some lines she delivers fine, but others feel like she's just half-assing it. Tip herself is kind of bland, but at least she isn't annoying or anything. I mean, in the end, you do want to see her find her mom and everything, but there's also nothing about her that really stands out. The rest of the characters are just kind of tacked onto the movie. Captain Smek is just your typical jerky and arrogant leader. Tip's mom is barely in the movie, even after she's found. Kyle is just an obstacle that O and Tip have to deal with. And the Gorg and the rest of the Boov are just there, I guess. The only other character I really got into, funny enough, was the cat. I have no idea why, but for a character with no lines and not that much screen time, I just thought this cat was adorable for some reason.
So because the story and the majority of the characters are bland, really this movie should be a forgettable dud. But since the main character is so likable, and the entire movie is spent with him, he becomes the only thing that really sticks with you after you see the movie. And it leaves you with just a pleasant feeling, because, again, he's just so likable. So what are the other pros and cons of this movie?
Well, the animation is pretty good. I mean, it is DreamWorks after all. Though, I must admit, they could have been a little more creative with the designs of the Boov. Is it just me, or do they just look like a rehashed version of that pink squid thing from Finding Nemo? The humor of this movie is really weak. They don't really tell a whole lot of jokes, and the ones they do tell are usually pretty painful. The only parts that got a giggle out of me are when the Boov, specifically O, don't understand the ways of Earth. Actually, O has the majority of the funny lines in the movie. Yeah, it's a pretty cliched concept, but it still got a chuckle out of me now and then. That said, not every line O has is funny. My hands are in the air like I just do not care.
Seriously? That line is just stupid! And they say it not once, but twice! Ugh. The only other things of real note are just other moments that stand out, both for the better and for the worse.
Something that didn't make any sense to me is when the Boov take over Earth. What's the problem? Well, they just come in, take over, and the people of Earth don't do anything about it. There's no attempt to stop them or fight back. They just let them come in, relocate everybody, and then just bitch and moan about it.
Seriously? No one tries to stop this?
But on the other hand, something I do like is the twist as to why the Gorg have been chasing the Boov for so long. It turns out that Smek stole a rock from the Gorg leader that actually contains the next generation of the Gorg. And the leader has been trying to get it back because it turns out he's actually the last of his kind. Therefore, the extinction of his people is on the line. I have to admit, I think this is a very good twist.
I think this gives a good message about questioning ethics.
Smek sees the rock and just takes it, because he can, and blames the Gorg constantly chasing them on the fact that the Gorg are just being selfish. When really, he and the Boov are the selfish ones. O is the kind of guy who will believe anything his leader tells him, and just blindly go along with it regardless of how unethical it is. But once this twist happens, he realizes just how much of a group of douchebags his people really are. Yeah, when you really think about it, the Boov are a bunch of assholes. But in the end, they do see the error of their ways, so I guess you can give them a pass. I also really like this one scene where we see a montage of moments where O and Tip are hanging out together, and they start to form a friendship. There isn't that much dialogue except for whatever bits of conversation they happen to show, yet you do see them starting to become friends, and you do notice the difference from how they got along before. The downside to this is, because it is such a predictable story, you can see this scene coming a mile away. But it's still done nicely, so I don't mind that much.
The last thing I'll bring up is there does seem to be effort put into this movie.
It's kind of hard to explain, but even though the final result isn't that interesting, you can tell they were trying to make a great family film. There is a lot of heart in this movie, it's just put behind a bland and rehashed story.
So, what's the final verdict?
Well, yeah, I guess this movie is the Turbo of 2015, because it really is just your standard kids film, with a cliched story and characters made more to keep your kids occupied than for the whole family to enjoy together. But unlike Turbo, where nothing stood out and there didn't really seem to be much effort put into it, this movie does stand out a little bit, with a very likable main character and actual effort put into it. I do think whether or not you'll like this movie depends on how much you can get into the main character. If you like him, he'll be enough to get you through the movie. If not, well, then you're kind of screwed, because nothing else in this movie is really interesting enough to keep you invested. So take that for what it's worth.
After all, there wasn't anything in this movie that pissed me off or anything. Well, except for that one line. My hands are in the air like I just do not care! Ugh, seriously, what the hell was that?